This is the story of two Belgian researchers who tracked down 39 living relatives of Adolf Hitler, tested their DNA in 2010, and published a finding that got twisted into one of the most misunderstood stories in modern genetics. Belgian journalist Jean-Paul Mulders teamed up with historian Mark Vermeuren in 2009, and together they set out to trace the living descendants of Adolf Hitler's family line. Hitler left behind no children of his own, but his father Alois had other relatives, and one branch of that bloodline eventually crossed the Atlantic and settled in the United States. By September of 2009, UPI had already picked up the story, reporting that the pair had located 39 relatives connected to the Hitler family. The clearest thread ran through William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's half-nephew, a man who had actually served in the United States Navy against his own uncle during the war. He later dropped the family name entirely, swapping Hitler for Stuart Houston, and built a quiet life on Long Island, running a blood analysis lab. His three sons, Alexander, Louis, and Brian, grew up there, and Alexander became the focus for Mulders and Vermeuren's investigation. Getting his DNA turned out to be anything but simple. Mulders reportedly followed Alexander Stuart Houston for roughly a week before the man finally discarded a used napkin, which the journalist then recovered and kept. Other samples came from a discarded cigarette butt belonging to an Austrian cousin identified in the coverage only as Norbert H. The two researchers even claimed to be sitting on an actual Hitler DNA sample, stored, they said, in a locked chest. None of this passed through a scientific journal or a peer review process. It was investigative journalism, plain and simple, and that distinction ends up mattering for everything that follows. Knack, a Flemish magazine, published the results on August 18, 2010, and the headline alone was enough to travel. Hitler, it claimed, was related to Somalis, Berbers, and Jews. What the DNA extracted from these relatives actually pointed to was a Y-chromosome haplogroup called E1b1b, sometimes labeled EM35 or E1b1b1. A Y-chromosome haplogroup traces one single unbroken line of fathers, stretching back thousands of years through a narrow genetic thread rather than painting any kind of full ancestral picture. E1b1b happens to be a well-documented one, believed to have emerged in East Africa or the Horn of Africa around 22,400 years ago. Today, it dominates the paternal lineage across North Africa, where one branch known as EM81 is often called the Berber marker and reaches close to 80% among some Moroccan Berber populations. The same haplogroup shows up heavily across the Horn of Africa, threads through the Middle East, and appears at notable levels across southern Europe, particularly in the Balkans and Greece. Here's what made this newsworthy at all. Hitler had built his entire worldview around the fantasy of a pure Aryan bloodline rooted in Northern Europe, and E1b1b simply isn't a marker typically tied to that region. Ronnie Decourt, a geneticist at Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, called the result surprising when Knack quoted him, adding that Hitler would not have been happy with what the science had turned up. Within days, the story caught fire across international press. The Daily Mail ran it on August 24, 2010, with reporting from Alan Hall, and the New York Daily News covered it that same day. Haaretz followed, along with the Jerusalem Post, Time, CBS News, HuffPost, and a string of other outlets over the following week. Most of that coverage did the same thing. It took a narrow, technical genetic finding and flattened it into a single explosive claim, that Hitler had secretly been Jewish and African all along. Some of the numbers that circulated in that coverage, figures like 18 to 20% of Ashkenazi Y chromosomes and 8.6 to 30% of Sephardic Y chromosomes belonging to E1b1b, trace back to a broader population genetics research on Jewish communities, not to anything Mulders or Vermeuren measured themselves. Those figures also describe a narrower sub-branch of the haplogroup, which meant the sweeping claims built on top of them were resting on shaky ground from the start. Family Tree DNA, a genetics company sitting on a database of roughly 200,000 samples at the time, stepped in on August 30th, 2010, with a public statement addressing the story head-on. Chief Y DNA scientist Michael Hammer laid out the real numbers. No less than 9% of the populations of Germany and Austria belong to haplogroup E1b1b. And among that 9%, roughly 80% have no connection to Jewish ancestry whatsoever. Put another way, the haplogroup supposedly proving something shocking about Hitler turns up in something like 1 out of every 11 men across Germany and Austria, the very population Hitler considered racially pure. Hammer's point was blunt: carrying haplogroup E1b1b does not mean a person is likely to be of Jewish ancestry. What nobody expected was that even Mulder's pushed back on his own story's afterlife. He later insisted he never wrote that Hitler was a Jew or that he had a Jewish grandfather, and his actual claim, he said, was narrower. Hitler's haplogroup E1b1b shows up more often among Berbers, Somalis, and Jews than among Germans as a whole. Everything beyond that, in his words, came from journalists who never bothered reading the article they were reporting on. The real problem underneath the popular version of this story comes down to a basic misunderstanding of what a haplogroup even measures. It is not a stamp of identity, ethnicity, or religion. It is a record of population movement across deep time, one single paternal thread out of millions of ancestors stretching back thousands of years. Most European men who carry E1b1b are not Jewish, and most are not North African either. They are simply carrying a branch of a lineage that spread across the Mediterranean world long before modern nations or religions existed at all. The 2010 investigation had its own problems too, separate from how it got reported. Peer review never touched it. Consent never entered the picture either, since the samples came through surveillance rather than any controlled scientific process. Nobody published the specific genetic markers used to pin down the exact subclade, and there was no verified genealogical trail proving every person tested actually shared Hitler's precise direct paternal line. That gap matters because Alois Hitler's own biological father has never been definitively established, leaving a real hole in the chain connecting these modern relatives back to Hitler with any real certainty. People often tangle the 2010 DNA story together with a much older and completely different claim that Hitler's paternal grandfather was a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger. That rumor had nothing to do with genetics. It traces back to Hans Frank, Hitler's own lawyer, who made the claim in a memoir written in 1946 while he sat awaiting execution for war crimes. Historians like Ian Kershaw and Richard Evans have rejected the claim outright. Evans has pointed out that even if Jewish families had lived in grades at the relevant time, that alone proves nothing about the identity of Hitler's actual grandfather. And he's gone so far as to call Frank's memoirs notoriously unreliable. No evidence ever surfaced that a Frankenberger family lived there at all, and Jewish residents had been barred from that region for much of the period in question anyway. So really, these are two entirely separate stories. One is a decades-old, largely discredited rumor about a Jewish grandfather with zero genetic evidence behind it, and the other is a 2010 DNA test that identified a specific Y-chromosome haplogroup, one that says nothing about Jewish ancestry specifically, no matter how the headlines framed it. 15 years later, the question resurfaced, and this time with actual physical evidence behind it. Channel 4 and the BBC aired a documentary in November of 2025, led by Professor Tori King, the geneticist best known for identifying the remains of King Richard III, and her team examined DNA pulled from a bloodstained piece of fabric cut from the sofa in Hitler's Berlin bunker at the time of his death. A US Army colonel had preserved that fabric. It passed down through his family for decades, and it eventually sold at auction in 2014 to the Gettysburg Museum of History. Researchers spent more than 4 years on the analysis, according to reporting on the documentary, and they pulled 3 DNA samples from the bloodstained fabric that matched a saliva sample collected years earlier from a living Austrian relative, the same male line first tested back in 2010. Professor King said the match confirmed the blood genuinely belonged to Hitler, and it confirmed something else too, that the old story of Jewish ancestry through his father is just simply not true. That 2025 research had not gone through peer review by the time the documentary aired, and it drew criticism of its own, mainly around separate claims in the same program about genetic predisposition to psychiatric conditions, which several scientists argued had been oversold for television. But on the specific question of the male line ancestry match, the finding lines up with, and adds, hard physical evidence too, the same genetic line identified back in 2010. So here's where all of this lands. Two Belgian researchers tracked down Hitler's living relatives in 2010 and found they carried a Y-chromosome haplogroup, E1b1b, common across North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and parts of the Mediterranean, and rare within the Northern European bloodline Hitler had built his entire ideology around. The press ran with a version of the story the actual genetics never supported, that this somehow proved Hitler was secretly Jewish or African. Family tree DNA's own numbers told a different story. Roughly 9% of Germans and Austrians carry that exact same haplogroup, and the overwhelming majority of them have no Jewish ancestry at all. Even the journalist who broke the story insisted he never made the claim that got attached to it. What actually happened turns out to be less sensational than the headlines, but a lot more interesting. A real genetic finding, badly explained, hardened into a myth that took years, and eventually a second, far more rigorous DNA study in 2025 to properly untangle. The haplogroup was real. Most of what people concluded from it was not,